With the fall of Iwo Jima, and with the Philippines campaign approaching its end, the time had come for the seizure of a base close to the Japanese homeland. This was considered essential before an attack on the main islands could be undertaken. Okinawa, lying at the southern end of the Nansei Shoto, was selected by Admiral Nimitz as the most desirable location for this base. This long, narrow island of the Ryukyu Group, southwest of Japan, lies in a latitude just outside of the tropics. About 500 square miles in area, it is 70 miles long and 5 to 7 miles wide. Its terrain contains many hills, but also plenty of level space for airfields. The climate is generally pleasant, although the island is known as the Typhoon Crossroads. Most of the typhoons which traverse the western Pacific pass either directly over it or close by. On the east coast, however, is a large harbour suitable for the anchorage of hundreds of ships. This haven was called Nakagusuku-wan by the Japanese, but soon after we took the island it was renamed Buckner Bay in honour of Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commander of the 10th Army, who was annihilated in the final phases of the campaign. The capture of Okinawa was to be the largest amphibious operation yet undertaken in the Pacific. Although the Normandy landing in the Atlantic exceeded it in size, it could not compare with it from the standpoint of the length of the communication lines or the logistic problems involved. Okinawa contained 5 airfields and was defended by approximately 140,000 Japanese, well armed and well equipped. Its capture would require the participation of more than 548,000 men of the Army, Navy and Marine Corps, and the naval forces employed would amount to 318 combatant vessels and 1,139 auxiliary ships, exclusive of landing craft. Only 350 miles from Kyushu, southernmost of the main Japanese islands, Okinawa supported a civilian population of about 445,000, most of them belonging to a primitive people, neither Chinese or Japanese, who had inhabited the island prior to Japanese occupation. The Okinawans were simple in nature, far from warlike, and not particularly devoted to their Japanese rulers. The Japanese looked down upon them as an inferior race, but they were valuable to their alien masters as labourers and tillers of the soil. When I visited the island, I was impressed with its delightful climate, the beautiful scenery of its rolling hills, the abundance of trees, and the friendliness of the natives. However, many of the evergreen trees were dwarfed and distorted in their growth, showing the effect of the tremendous typhoon winds. It was a matter of comment that nature in Okinawa was something like the Japanese militarist mentality, stunted and twisted in its development. The operations for the capture of Okinawa, which went on simultaneously with the latter part of the occupation of the Philippines, were under the jurisdiction of Admiral Nimitz, who assigned the command to Admiral Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet. The Joint Expeditionary Force, consisting of the amphibious forces and all elements directly engaged in the landings, was under Vice Admiral, later Admiral Richmond K. Turner. General Buckner's expeditionary troops were organized as the 10th Army and comprised 2 corps, the 3rd Amphibious Corps, under Major General Roy S. Geiger, United States Marine Corps, composed of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, and the 24th Army Corps under Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, United States Army, which included the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions. The 27th and 77th Infantry Divisions functioned later as components of the 24th Corps, but did not participate in the opening phases of the campaign. The Fast Carrier Force under Admiral Mitscher was assigned the task of supporting the operation and furnishing air support for the landings as well as for the subsequent fighting on shore. In addition, there was a British carrier force, Vice Admiral H.B. Rawlings Royal Navy, a logistics supply group under Rear Admiral D.B. Beery, consisting of tankers and cargo vessels which serviced the fleet close to the combat area, an amphibious support force under Rear Admiral later Admiral W.H.P. Blandy, comprising escort carriers, minesweepers, underwater demolition teams, and the gunnery ships assigned to bombardment missions, and the gunfire and covering force under Rear Admiral M.L. Deo, consisting of the old battleships and other gunnery vessels. Prior to the main landing, the islands of the Karama-Reto Group, 20 miles to the southwest, were seized in order to establish there a supply and repair base for the hundreds of small craft used in the campaign and for seaplane operations. In addition, the small island of Kaisashima, about 10 miles from the landing beaches and only 5.5 miles from Naha, capital city of Okinawa, was to be occupied. On this spot, army artillery could be placed to command the entire southern end of the larger island. The whole preliminary operation embraced minesweeping on a scale never before undertaken, the clearing of obstructions in the shallow water off the landing beaches by those men of iron nerves, the underwater demolition teams, and intensive bombardment of the enemy's shore defences by air and naval forces. The magnitude of this amphibious attack is shown by the fact that cargo and troops were loaded and embarked in ships on the west coast of the United States, in the Hawaiian Islands, the southwestern Pacific, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and Leyte. After loading, the huge force assembled at Ulithi, Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Leyte, where they rehearsed their various roles. They sailed for their objectives in more than 1,200 ships and arrived off Okinawa without interference from the enemy. On March 26, 1945, when Keramaretto and Kaisashima were occupied, nets were immediately laid to protect the anchorages against hostile submarines. The seaplane base was established, and tankers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels were brought into the harbour to begin their work of supplying and repairing ships engaged in the occupation. Due to the hundreds of kamikaze attacks which soon developed, this base played an important part in maintaining our forces thousands of miles from their home ports. At 8:30 on the morning of April 1, 1945, after 7 days of intense ship and air bombardment, the attack waves of the 10th Army left their line of departure and through a smokescreen swarmed across the reef in amphitracks, the unique water and land craft developed especially for such amphibious operations. They landed on the beach just south of Yontan Airfield, located about halfway up the western coast. Strong resistance had been expected, but strange to say, no serious opposition developed either during the landing or immediately afterward. By 12:30, both Yontan and Kadena airfields had been captured with only light losses, the former almost intact, with many operational enemy planes still on its runways or in its revetments. Before dark, approximately 50,000 troops were on shore and had gained a beachhead 4,000 to 5,000 yards in depth. The ease with which the initial landing had been accomplished was astonishing. It gave no indication of the tough, bitter fighting which was to develop later. The Japanese had learned much from our previous attacks. On this island, there would be little tactical blundering, no expenditure of their strength in useless missions, and none of the unnecessary dying for the sake of dying which had marked so many of their previous campaigns. Before Okinawa was ours, our troops were to experience many weeks of deadly combat. Although the Japanese had not planned to defend Yontan Airfield, they had intended to destroy the planes and make the field unserviceable. This task had been assigned to a special unit composed of second-rate troops and Okinawa conscripts, but they had proved so low in morale and were so inadequately armed that under the pre-landing bombardment they had taken hastily to their heels without remaining to accomplish their work of destruction. This was a lucky break. It was soon found that the Japanese had withdrawn most of their forces into the southernmost part of the island and had established their defences in great depth on terrain admirably suited for the purpose. Here they had constructed blockhouses, pillboxes, and caves, all strongly protected by barbed wire and minefields in great profusion. They took every advantage of the ground and were unsparing in their use of artillery. 4 divisions of our troops had landed abreast on the beaches on the western side of the island, just south of the narrow Ishikawa Isthmus. They proceeded rapidly across the island to the east shore, and on April 4th the entire Yontan-Kadena segment was in our possession. The plan was for the 24th Corps to seize all of the island to the south and the Marine 3rd Amphibious Corps all the territory to the north. The Marines pushed rapidly northward, not pausing to mop up the isolated enemy groups ensconced in caves or other places of concealment. Leaving these nests to their reserves, they pressed on and by April 8th had passed the neck of the rugged Motobu Peninsula. One regiment was deployed across the base of this peninsula to seal it off from the rest of the island. Other columns continued their advance against increasingly difficult terrain. The action then developed into a slow, deadly slugging match. Finally, a breakthrough on the western sector was achieved on April 17th, and after that it became a matter of mopping up isolated groups of the enemy. Motobu Peninsula, which had been sealed off, was secured by April 22nd, when all organized resistance in the northern two-thirds of the island ceased. Its reduction was a story of ousting the enemy with rifles, hand grenades, and flamethrowers. Many enemy detachments were burned out or sealed underground by closing the entrances of the caves. 3½ miles west of Motobu lay the island of Ieshima, about 7 square miles in area and containing a large airfield. It was garrisoned by a Japanese battalion. Ieshima would be a valuable fighter base for intercepting the many enemy planes coming down from Japan to attack our ships. Accordingly, on April 16th, the 77th Division made a landing on the western end of the island, which was secured on the 21st against spotty resistance. During these operations, the famous war correspondent, Ernie Pyle, was annihilated by an enemy shell. He was buried there by the soldiers who loved him so well. In the army advance to the south, the troops encountered the main strength of the enemy defence. Between April 4th and May 26th, an advance of only about 4 miles was made. On April 11th, our forces took a heavy pounding from the greatest and best coordinated concentration of Japanese artillery yet encountered in the Pacific. 2 additional airfields had been taken, Yonabaru on the east and Makinato on the west, but there were no signs that the Japanese resistance was weakening. By this time, the troops were badly in need of rest, and on April 30th, the 1st Marine Division relieved the 27th Division. At the same time, the 77th Division from Ieshima relieved the 96th Division in the centre. It was apparent, however, that the entire line needed strengthening. The whole western sector was reassigned on May 7th to the Marine 3rd Amphibious Corps, which had completed its conquest of the northern part of the island on April 27th. This left the 24th Corps of the Army concentrated on the eastern end of the line. The hard core of the Japanese defences extended in an arc across the usually pleasant Okinawa hills from Naha, on the west coast, through ancient Shuri to the village of Yonabaru on the east. In front of them were strong outlying positions about 2 miles in depth, which were manned solidly by dug-in Japanese. In 2 weeks of slow, bitterly contested action, every ridge and hill, every cave and pillbox had to be taken by attack. During this period, planes of my task group were called upon for an operation which illustrates the difficulty of the fighting on shore. Army troops were being held up by a cave on the reverse slope of a hill, whose summit was occupied by our troops. Our lines were only 50 yards from the cave, but it was impossible to seal it off or hurl hand grenades into it from the top. Attempts to take it by attack had resulted in some 300 casualties. In this dilemma, the sector commander asked our planes to land a bomb in the entrance of the cave with our troops only 50 yards away. The pilots assigned this mission landed at Yontan Airfield for special briefing and to examine photographs of the locality. The army was willing to accept the hazard of our bombs landing within their lines, for even if that happened, their casualties would be fewer than those they had suffered in vainly attacking the position frontally. After a rehearsal run, the bombers dived and released their bombs at hardly more than hilltop altitude. The mouth of the cave was covered with bursts, and our troops on the summit promptly scrambled down the hillside as the plane left the area. Radio reports from the ground officers stated that the accuracy of the bombing had been striking. Only 1 bomb had dropped within our lines, and fortunately it was a dud. The position which had held up the advance for day was taken with scarcely a casualty. The army commander reported that the planes had given him the acme of ground support. The relentless pressure of our troops was gradually wearing down the Japanese morale. The enemy were physically weary and could look for neither relief nor rest periods. Our forces advanced until all of the town of Shuri was in our hands except the ancient castle, with its rugged masonry walls, on the crest of the hill. Unexpectedly discovering an open approach, the Marines overcame the weakened defenders, and on May 29th hoisted the flag over that formidable citadel. Its capture ended the most bitter and protracted fighting of the land campaign. With the collapse of the Naha-Shuri-Yonabaru line, the enemy's resistance crumbled in the central eastern portion of the defences, and the American troops, hampered by mud and by cold, driving rain, advanced against scattered snipers. Embarked in landing craft at Naha, elements of the 6th Marine Division proceeded along the coast and landed behind the enemy on the outer end of Oroku Peninsula. By nightfall of June 4th, most of Naha airfield was in our hands. The main advance down the center of the island on June 9th met a new line of resistance. On Kunisi Ridge, stretching almost completely across the southern end of the island, the Japanese had prepared for their last stand, a second defensive position almost as formidable as the previous one. It consisted of entrenchments on the ridge, which were further protected by the river flowing along its base. The attack on this new position started on June 18th. The Marines on the right made a good advance against weakening enemy resistance. The army units on the left, however, found progress slower. General Buckner took this occasion to visit the front to observe conditions. He was visiting a command post on a hill which afforded an excellent view of the forward lines. Although the Japanese artillery had been quiescent and no shells had fallen on the position all morning, a single gun opened up with a few rounds. The first shell annihilated General Buckner, leaving others in the vicinity untouched. Upon his death, the late Lieutenant General Roy S. Geiger of the Marines succeeded to the command of the expeditionary troops. This was by far the largest combined force of Army and Marine units ever commanded by a Marine. Geiger was an outstanding aviator, equally at home commanding air or ground forces. He had followed General A. Vandergrift in command of the I Marine Amphibious Corps in the Solomons on November 10, 1943, and had been in command at capture of Guam. Geiger was later relieved by General Joseph W. Stilwell. By dark on June 21st, the Army and Marine units in hand-to-hand fighting, assisted by flamethrowers and tanks, wiped out the last organized Japanese in their caves and foxholes, and organized resistance on the island was declared to have ended. The campaign had lasted 82 days. While the fighting on land was going on, the Navy was conducting an operation of unparalleled magnitude at sea. It was our job to protect the thousands of ships of the invasion forces against air attack originating in the home islands of Japan, as well as to furnish direct air support to the troops on shore. Both the fast carriers and the escort carriers participated in this assignment. In accomplishing its mission, the American fleet was to suffer the heaviest punishment it had ever taken. The fast carriers, stationed just east of Okinawa, made frequent devastating strikes on Kyushu and on islands between Kyushu and Okinawa. The jeep carriers assisted in giving air support to the troops and made strikes on the islands to the south, toward Formosa. With most of their fleet immobilized, the Japanese centered their efforts in kamikaze attacks on the armada of shipping concentrated in the invasion area. They hoped to use their remaining planes, which still numbered in the thousands, to wipe out our ships, leaving the troops on shore marooned without supplies. We had experienced Japanese suicide attacks before, but they had never approached in magnitude the effort put out in defense of Okinawa. Many of the enemy pilots had little experience, but the planes came down incessantly, day after day. No coordination was evident as each plane individually sought to crash itself with its lethal cargo against an American ship. Inexperienced in navigation, the pilots generally followed the chain of islands as landmarks to reach Okinawa. Fortunately, the fast carriers were approximately 60 miles off this track. Nevertheless, hardly a day passed without their being subjected to numerous attacks by kamikazes, as well as by aircraft using conventional methods. The fast carrier task force was now divided into 4 main groups, commanded by Rear Admirals J.J. Clark, R.E. Davison, A.W. Radford, and myself. There was also a 5th group, equipped exclusively with night fighters and night torpedo planes, under Rear Admiral M.B. Gardner. This detachment included only one carrier, the Enterprise, which at this time furnished the planes for night operations. The carriers employed in day operations included the Hornet, Bennington, Wasp, Franklin, Hancock, Essex, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, and Intrepid, in addition to the light carriers Belleau Wood, San Jacinto, Bataan, Cabot, Independence, and Langley. Included in the carrier task force were 8 fast battleships, the 2 new cruisers, Hawaii and Guam, 14 other heavy and light cruisers, and 64 destroyers. The Okinawa campaign was inaugurated by a fast carrier strike on the Kyushu Inland Sea area on March 18th and 19th. Detected by Japanese snooper planes during its approach, the task force had to fight off a large pre-dawn air attack in which the Intrepid and Enterprise received bomb hits, but suffered only minor damage and continued to operate. Approximately 45 airfields were involved, many of which were found to be covered with planes. Although the Japanese lacked trained aviators, they had no shortage of aircraft. Scores of fighters were in the air when our planes arrived. The intense air opposition produced many sharp aerial engagements, but our bombing and strafing attacks reduced to ashes virtually all the buildings on the airfields and damaged or destroyed 275 planes on the ground. Our fighters shot down 102 enemy planes on the first day. Photographs taken on the 18th revealed many enemy combatant ships concentrated at Kure and Kobe, naval bases on the inland sea. We did not know it at the time, but many of the vessels were inoperative and had sought refuge in those waters after the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea. Admiral Mitchell decided to send our strikes on the second day against these ships, instead of continuing to hit the already seriously crippled airfields. Again, the planes thundered down the carrier flight decks for the second day of attacks. Murderous anti-aircraft fire was encountered, but an enemy battleship, a hybrid battleship carrier, 5 carriers, a heavy cruiser and a light cruiser were all hit and severely damaged. Although many of them were probably unfit for sea, these attacks were insurance against any further activity by the Japanese fleet. While the attacks were going on, numerous enemy planes appeared over the task force and attempted to retaliate against our carriers. Our combat air patrols and anti-aircraft guns downed many of them, but my flagship, the Essex, was narrowly missed twice by dive bombers. One plane barely cleared the flight deck and splashed close aboard on the port bow, while the other, hit by flak in its dive, landed close on the port beam a half-hour later. Other carriers were not so fortunate. The Yorktown sustained minor damage from glancing bomb hits, the Wasp received a direct hit, the Enterprise took a bomb in her forward elevator, and the Franklin received 2 bombs squarely on her flight deck, which started a series of devastating explosions and fires. The Yorktown, Enterprise, and Wasp were able to continue in action, but the Franklin was grievously crippled. Burning furiously, thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline gushed from ruptured supply lines. Planes on both hangar and flight decks caught fire, and their exploding bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition added to the uproar. Admiral Davison, whose flag was on board, transferred to another carrier to direct his task group. Captain Leslie E. Gares, commander of the Franklin, was determined to save his ship and refused to give up. For 3 hours the violent explosions continued, with the ship dead in the water and unable to steam. Finally, late in the day, the explosions became less frequent, and the cruiser Pittsburgh took the carrier in tow. During the night, the fires burned themselves out, and the engineers were able to go below and restart the engines. The Franklin ultimately returned to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for a major repair job. Of her crew of approximately 3,000 officers and men, 832 had been annihilated and 270 wounded. Her return to port under her own power was an exploit that testified to her crew's determination, stamina, and courage. In addition to the enemy ships damaged at Kure and Kobe, the second day's strikes destroyed 97 more planes in the air and 225 on the ground. The task force then retired to rendezvous with the tankers for fuel. While we were withdrawing, a large group of bogies was detected about 100 miles away. Extra fighters were scrambled, and within a few minutes 150 Hellcats were in the air and away to intercept them. They found 32 two-engine Bettys and 16 single-engine fighters. In a short wild melee, all the Japanese planes were shot down, with the loss of only 2 of our Hellcats. Underneath the fuselage of each enemy bomber, our flyers noticed a small, peculiar pair of wings. These were subsequently discovered to be rocket-propelled flying bombs, each manned by a suicide pilot. They were intended to be launched from their mother plane close to their targets, and it was estimated that they could attain a speed of over 500 miles an hour. Our boys called these new weapons Baka bombs, from the Japanese word for fool. Although the enemy failed to launch any of them in this attack, ships in the Okinawa area were hit later by similar missiles. On the whole, however, they achieved no great success. On March 23rd and 24th, the task force returned to Okinawa for the pre-invasion attacks and for late photographic coverage of the landing beaches for the invasion forces, then underway for their initial landing. My task group, with that of Admiral Radford, returned to Kyushu on March 29th for another strike on the enemy fleet units previously sighted in those waters. Our search planes were unable to locate the ships under their camouflage, and the bombs were dropped on airfields along the coast. The destruction of warehouses, hangars, barracks, and grounded airplanes was getting to be a familiar story. In addition, numerous small ships, fishing boats, and sampans were sunk. During these operations, Lieutenant Junior Grade Ronald Lee Somerville, a dive bomber pilot from the Hancock, made a forced landing in Kagoshima Bay as a result of an operational accident. His position was hazardous. He was in the middle of the bay, 15 miles from its mouth, with many enemy airfields only a short distance away. 2 seaplanes were immediately catapulted from the Astoria and dispatched to his rescue with an escort of 24 fighters. On the way in, the group was intercepted by a squadron of aggressive Japanese fighters, and a vicious aerial fight followed. 5 enemy fighters were splashed, and when the battle ended, the air had been cleared of all opposition. One of our fighter pilots, Ensign David Kelleher from the Cabot, was shot down, but was able to parachute and was in the water near Somerville. The 2 seaplanes swooped into the bay, landed, and picked up both men not more than 2 miles off the beach of a major enemy airfield. Upon taking them aboard, they gunned their engines and took off under the protection of our fighters. Within an hour, they had returned the 2 downed pilots to their ships. During the day, the force was under almost continuous attack by enemy planes, but so tight was our fighter defense that only one was able to get through. It dropped a bomb at the Cabot, but missed, and the plane was shot down on its way out. Many other enemy planes were splashed by our fighters before reaching bombing positions. The enemy's all-out air effort began on April 5th and was coordinated with a major counterattack by their ground forces on Okinawa. The air battles reached their highest intensity on April 6th. That day, ships and planes of my task group alone destroyed 105 airborne enemy planes and an additional 17 on the ground. In the late afternoon of the 6th, a message from 2 of our submarines stated that they had sighted Japanese fleet units, including at least 1 battleship, heading south for Okinawa along the east coast of Kyushu. All other missions were halted while our search planes went out next morning to verify this contact. If the report was correct, it would mean another chance at the surface ships of the dwindling Japanese Navy. At 8:15 a.m., we were thrilled by a flash from our search planes that they had sighted an enemy force consisting of a large battleship, 1 or 2 cruisers, and 7 or 8 destroyers. The battleship was the gigantic Yamato, sister ship of the Musashi, which had been sunk by our planes a little over 4 months before in the Sibuyan Sea. The Yamato was bound for one last suicide effort against our forces off Okinawa. The weather in the vicinity of the Yamato was poor, with ceiling at 3,000 feet, visibility 5 to 8 miles, and occasional rain squalls. Nevertheless, the search planes remained in contact and kept us continuously informed of her position, course, and speed. Mitcher directed my group and Clark's to make coordinated attacks, to be followed 1 hour later by one from Radford's group. Armed with heavy bombs and torpedoes, the planes took off. Just after noon, they arrived at the scene of action. The weather had worsened, but regardless of the heavy recurrent rain squalls, they concentrated their attacks on the huge battleship. Vice Admiral Ito of the Imperial Japanese Navy, commander of the enemy force, had his flag aboard the Yamato. She was accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. With considerable difficulty, the Japanese had scraped up the 2,500 tons of fuel oil necessary for this operation. After the war, Admiral Toyoda, their naval commander-in-chief, said that additional units of the Second Fleet had been prevented from participation by lack of fuel. Although they felt there was not a 50-50 chance of success, the enemy commanders reasoned that nothing would be gained by keeping the ships idle in home waters, and that their mission was in keeping with the traditions and honor of the Japanese Navy. Boring in against a tremendous volume of anti-aircraft fire, including projectiles from the mammoth 18.1-inch turret guns of the Yamato, the first attacks landed 2 heavy bombs on the battleship's deck and punctured her port side with 1 torpedo. In addition, the cruiser Yahagi was hit and stopped, and the destroyer Hamikaze was sunk. Other destroyers were damaged by strafing. About an hour later, the 3rd Air Group attacked. In a few moments, the Yamato was hit by 3 additional bombs and 9 torpedoes. Dead in the water and mortally wounded, the stricken ship blew up, capsized, and sank at 2:23 p.m. She and her sister ship, the Musashi, were the largest battleships ever constructed. It was learned after the war that in addition to displacing over 72,000 tons, she had embraced all the latest improvements known to the shipbuilder's art. The Yahagi, repeatedly hit by bombs and torpedoes, sank at 2:05 p.m. 3 destroyers were also sunk. Only the 3 surviving destroyers returned to their base at Sasebo. Of a total of 386 aircraft participating in these attacks, our losses were 4 dive bombers, 3 torpedo planes and 3 fighters, all to anti-aircraft fire. This action was one more example of the dominance of air power in fighting at sea, of aircraft sinking a battleship of the most modern type without the help of surface vessels. After the action, our battleships off Okinawa sent us a facetious message, sorrowfully regretting that we had deprived them of a chance for a little target practice. While our planes were attacking the Yamato, enemy aircraft were giving us attention in the launching area. 2 suicide planes dived on the Essex and were shot down in flames. Another plummeted at the Hancock and crashed squarely on her flight deck. 28 men were annihilated and 52 wounded, with some 15 missing. The Hancock had a 20-foot hole in her flight deck, while her forward elevator was buckled, and both catapults were out of commission. These damages prevented further flight operations. Although heavy fires broke out, they were under control in about an hour, and the ship was able to land her returning strike planes about 4:15. She remained with the task group temporarily, but was sent home for repairs the next morning. Day after day, we continued our operations off Okinawa, furnishing air patrols over the ground forces, and withdrawing about 100 miles to the eastward to refuel from our tankers when necessary. Minor enemy attacks were a matter of daily occurrence, but not until April 11th did large groups again appear. The attack started shortly after noon. By 2:35, the air was full of anti-aircraft fire and enemy planes were being splashed right and left. The destroyer Kidd, in a radar patrol line about 40 miles from the task force, was hard hit by a suicide plane. The Enterprise had 2 men blown overboard as the result of a near miss. Soon afterward, a kamikaze was splashed just off the starboard bow of the Essex. Then a bomb landed close aboard her port quarter, shaking the ship as violently as if she had struck a mine. At 3:15, the destroyer Bullard, also on picket duty, was hit by a suicide plane. At 3:30, the Enterprise received another near miss. Attacks continued until well after dark. We destroyed 11 enemy planes by ship's gunfire alone during the day. On Friday, April 13th, we received word of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the midst of the fighting, we were unable to spend much time considering what effect this tragic event would have on the war. Another big day was April 16th. We sent fighter sweeps north to Kanoya, where 30 enemy planes were shot down. In addition, 6 bogies were destroyed in the vicinity of the force. One came in from the direction of the sunset and was shot down just off Bunker Hill. The Intrepid was hit and damaged again by a kamikaze. Our daily routine followed very much the same pattern. Each night, small groups of enemy planes appeared on our radar screen and endeavored to penetrate our defenses. Night fighters were launched to intercept them. Usually, the attackers were shot down before they got within 30 miles of our disposition. Those that evaded the night fighters were bagged by the anti-aircraft fire. By day, larger groups of enemy planes approached and were intercepted by our fighters. Individual planes continued poorly coordinated attempts to make suicide crashes against our carriers. My log of the time contains numerous entries such as bomb missed the Bunker Hill, going into the water astern of her, suicide plane shot down by ship's gunfire, enemy plane narrowly missed Bataan, diving low over flight deck and plunging into water close aboard on her port beam. Each day our planes carried out their patrols over the ground forces fighting on Okinawa, and performed missions assigned by the air commander on the island. One of their principal tasks was intercepting and destroying kamikaze planes attempting to attack our transports and shipping which thronged the waters off the landing beaches. The Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikaze planes on May 11th. Somehow they had managed to escape our radar detection and were first sighted diving on the veteran carrier at 10:12 a.m. Heavy fires raged on board for over 4 hours before they were finally brought under control. It was a sad occasion when we had to detach this carrier and send her home for repairs. She had been the flagship of Admiral Mitchell, who was transferred by destroyer from the Bunker Hill to the Enterprise. On May 13th and 14th, my task group, together with that of Rear Admiral Clark, made another strike, our third, on the Kyushu airfields. Despite the many devastating attacks on their bases, the Japanese somehow were able to continue sending planes on their desperate missions. By 10:30 a.m. on the 13th, a total of 20 enemy planes had been shot down within or near our disposition. During these 2 days off Kyushu, 118 enemy planes were destroyed and 11,000 tons of enemy shipping sunk or damaged. On May 11th, the Enterprise was again hit by a suicide plane. This time she was damaged so badly that she in turn had to go back for repairs. 13 of her planes were destroyed by the explosion and resulting fire, and 13 men were annihilated and 32 wounded. The fires were soon extinguished, but the carrier could no longer operate her planes. Once more, Mitchell had to transfer with his staff to another ship, this time to the Randolph. Halsey relieved Spruance on May 28th as fleet commander, and about the same time, McCain relieved Mitchell. Task Force 58 then again became Task Force 38. On May 28th, my task group was directed to proceed to Leyte Gulf for rest and relaxation. We arrived there holding a new Navy record of 79 days at sea, during 52 of which we had engaged in combat with the enemy. It had been a period of intense strain, and the kamikaze planes which were continuously in our midst had made the assignment a tough one. During the Okinawa campaign, the British carrier force, consisting of 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 4 light cruisers and 11 destroyers, had been stationed south of Okinawa to support the operation by sending airstrikes against the Japanese air bases in Sakashima Gunto and Formosa. This British force operated from March 26th to April 20th, and again from May 3rd to May 25th. During its absence, our jeep carriers took over its combat assignments. It was not equipped to stay at sea as long as the American forces, and had to withdraw more frequently to replenish supplies, which were usually obtained at Manus. Although all the British carriers were hit by suicide planes, thanks to their armoured flight decks, none was put out of action. Another sweep was made over the Kyushu bases on June 2nd and 3rd, but there were few enemy planes either in the air or on the ground. On June 8th, Kanoya Airfield, the enemy's principal Kyushu base, was hit again, but only a small flight of enemy planes took off to contest our control of the air. They were soon shot down, and the Japanese ability to strike in force from his Kyushu bases appeared to be definitely ended. The major kamikaze attacks were made on our forces off Okinawa during the period April 6th to June 22nd. The total suicide sorties by the enemy amounted to 1,900, while planes using orthodox methods of attack made many more, Japanese naval aircraft alone reporting 3,700 sorties of the regular kind. Admiral Halsey recommended about that time that Marine Air Group 14, stationed in the Philippines, be brought forward to operate from our Okinawa air bases and take over with the Army Air Force whatever air support missions were still required. Upon its arrival, the entire fast carrier task force was withdrawn to Leyte Gulf to prepare for the next operation. For nearly 3 months, the fast carriers had operated in and near the Okinawa area, supporting the ground forces engaged in the occupation of this important base. Ashore, the American losses were 7,213 annihilated and missing, and 31,081 wounded. Afloat, the cost was also high. 4,907 annihilated and missing, 4,824 wounded. During the course of the campaign, 36 of our vessels had been sunk and 368 damaged, most of them as a result of air action. 12 of our destroyers had been sunk, and major repairs were required by 10 battleships, 13 carriers, 5 cruisers, and 67 destroyers. Our air losses amounted to 763 planes. The fact that we could take these losses without their affecting the continuance of our operations indicates the enormous size to which our naval forces had grown. The cost to the Japanese was greater still. On Okinawa, approximately 131,000 men were annihilated and 7,400 captured. At sea, 16 of their combatant ships had been sunk and 4 damaged, and in the air and on the ground more than 7,800 enemy aircraft had been destroyed. By the conquest of Okinawa, the American forces had acquired a major base, with numerous airfield sites and fleet anchorages, within 350 miles of the southern main island of Japan. A tremendous program of development, involving enlargement and new construction of air, ground, and naval facilities, was immediately undertaken preparatory to the projected invasion of Japan itself. The supremacy of carriers in control of the sea had previously been shown in actions between ships. At Okinawa, they proved their ability to stand up against land-based aircraft and to maintain that control up to the enemy shores. When they took their stations in the limited waters around the Japanese islands, it was no sneak attack, no hit-and-run affair. Their presence was no secret, and they invited the enemy's air force to come and attack them. They took everything a major air power could throw at them and still retained control of the air. They were the fleet that came to stay. At Leyte Gulf, I was notified that I was to relieve Admiral Mitcher as commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force. With mixed feelings, I turned over the command of Task Group 38.3 to Rear Admiral G.F.E. Bogan on the Essex, my flagship in so many engagements, and took a plane from our new naval air station at Samar for 30 days' leave at home. I spent a night as the house guest of Admiral Nimitz at Guam. Then I continued via Kwajalein, Johnson Island, Pearl Harbor, and Oakland, arriving back in San Diego on June 22nd, and later flying to Washington to confer with Fleet Admiral King and Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. It was apparent that the war was in its final stages. Admiral Nimitz informed me during my conference at Guam that our next objective was to be the Japanese main island of Kyushu. The job of the fast carriers in this operation would be the same as at Okinawa, giving the landing forces air support and protecting our ships against probably stepped-up kamikaze attacks. In the meantime, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet had gone on the rampage in further strikes on the home islands of Japan, to keep up the pressure while preparations were being made for the invasion scheduled for the following November. With little opposition, Halsey's men raided the coasts of Japan from one end to the other. Realizing that our next move would be an invasion of their main islands, the Japanese adopted a policy of conserving their strength for this eventuality. They elaborately dispersed and camouflaged their remaining aircraft, making it exceedingly difficult to locate and destroy them on the ground. They cancelled all search operations so that our fast carriers were able to strike wherever and whenever they wished, achieving complete tactical surprise. Supplementing the airstrikes, our battleships and cruisers carried out surface bombardment of industrial targets on the eastern coast of Japan, while destroyers conducted anti-shipping sweeps of coastal waters. The Japanese Navy, as well as their land-based air force, was completely impotent. Our control of the air and sea was supreme, around the shores of Japan as well as over the entire area of the Pacific Ocean. On July 10th, the fast carriers under McCain struck again at airfields and industrial plants in the Tokyo area. 72 enemy planes were destroyed on the ground, and damage was inflicted on other targets. Although no attempt was made to conceal the location of the fleet, no planes came out to attack it, and few rose to defend the Japanese capital. Halsey then moved his armada farther north for strikes against Hokkaido and northern Honshu. With monotonous regularity, the planes flew off for their objectives on July 14th and 15th. Again, extensive damage was inflicted on aircraft and airfield installations. Surface units went in close enough to shore to conduct gunfire bombardments of Kamaishi in northern Honshu and Muroran in Hokkaido. To accomplish the latter, the ships had to approach through an arm of the sea which was landlocked on 3 sides, a 3-hour trip each way, in plain sight of land. Halsey expected that the Japanese would surely use this opportunity for an air attack, but no planes came out. The enemy's only reaction to the surface ships was a desultory anti-aircraft fire against their spotting planes. The carrier aircraft, in these 2 attacks, destroyed 140 ships and small craft totaling 71,000 tons, shot up 38 planes and wrecked 84 locomotives. In addition, they set on fire and gutted 20 city blocks in the town of Kushiro. Much of Japan's coal and iron came from mines on Hokkaido, from whence they had to be transferred to the main island of Honshu on train ferries. In their 2 days' strikes, the planes sank 6 of these ferries, seriously disrupting the enemy's transport of raw materials to their industrial plants. On July 18th, the carriers made another strike on Tokyo with results similar to the first. Then, on the 24th and 25th, came a knockout strike on the crippled remnants of the Japanese Navy moored in the inland sea around the Kure naval base. Whereas the Navy was incapable of operating as a cohesive force, many fleet units were still afloat. In concentrated attacks, our planes inflicted additional damage on 22 naval vessels, including 6 major ships, totaling 258,000 tons. The units in the Kure anchorage included the flight deck battleships Ise and Hyuga and the regular battleship Haruna, the carriers Amagi, Katsuragi, and Ryujo, and the cruisers Tone, Aoba, Oyodo, Iwate, Izumo, and Setsu. In this attack, the Ise received 10 direct hits and many near misses. Her commanding officer and all personnel in the vicinity of the bridge were annihilated, and she settled by the bow and took considerable water. The Hyuga also took 10 direct hits and was so badly flooded that she grounded shortly after the attack. The battleship Haruna received such severe damage that she filled with water and settled on the bottom. The aircraft carrier Amagi was hit with both rockets and bombs, which caused heavy damage to the flight and hangar decks and flooded one of her engine rooms as well as 4 boiler rooms. The carrier Katsuragi received only 1 hit, but was rendered unfit for aircraft operations by damage to her flight and hangar decks. The carrier Ryujo had been badly damaged in the attack on March 19th, and after temporary repairs in the Navy Yard was moved to a new mooring and cleverly camouflaged. She was not discovered or attacked on July 24th. The heavy cruisers Tone and Aoba were hit by numerous bombs and settled on the bottom. The light cruiser Oyodo, flagship of the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was so severely pounded that she capsized before settling in the mud. Similar fates were dealt out to the old cruisers Iwata, Izumo, and Setsu. Not satisfied with the destruction inflicted on the 24th, Halsey brought his force back on the 28th to resume the action. By sunset that evening, he reports in his memoirs, the Japanese Navy had ceased to exist. Little had been left of the enemy's ships after the previous attacks, but the Americans were determined to destroy the Japanese fleet completely. Halsey gave 3 reasons. First, for the sake of our national morale, in retaliation for Pearl Harbor. Second, on account of the Russians, in case the war continued and we had to establish a supply line to Vladivostok. And third, to prevent the Japanese from using the existence of part of their fleet as a bargaining point at the peace table. After the final fast carrier strikes on Kure on July 28th, the planes hit Tokyo and Nagoya again on July 30th. On August 9th and 10th, they again raided Hokkaido and northern Honshu. Tokyo received its last strikes of the war on August 13th and 15th. In conjunction with these air attacks, surface ships conducted gun bombardments of coastal targets at Omura, Shionomisaki, Hamamatsu, and Shimizu, all on southern Honshu, and whereas these bombardments by our surface ships inflicted some damage on industrial plants in urban areas, their principal effect was on Japanese morale. They brought home to the Japanese people that the sacred soil of Japan was not immune to our attacks, and that, contrary to the statements of their leaders, the war was not going successfully. The aviators who participated in flights over the areas bombarded by surface ships, gunfire felt that the ship's guns accomplished little actual damage, and that the aircraft required to give them cover might better have been employed in direct attacks on the enemy. Nevertheless, they undoubtedly had some effect on morale and encouraged our battleship sailors to feel that they were not merely bystanders. In addition to the attacks by carrier aircraft, shore-based planes from the Marianas and Okinawa, including Navy patrol planes, as well as B-29s, conducted extensive bombing missions against the Japanese homeland. They accomplished widespread destruction of land targets and burned much of Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. However, information obtained from Japan after the war established the fact that the vital destruction of the Japanese fleet was accomplished entirely by carrier planes. One activity of the B-29s during the last 3 or 4 months of the war was the mining of the waters of the inland sea and the principal harbors of Japan. The mines dropped were of the so-called unsweepable type. They were exploded by the pressure in the water generated by the passage of ships overhead. Shimonoseki Strait, one of the exits of the inland sea between Honshu and Kyushu, was so thickly sown with these mines that many ships attempting its passage were sunk, and it had to be closed to traffic. The whole inland sea was planted with thousands of them. Their removal was a tremendous problem at the end of hostilities. Working in conjunction with our Third Fleet in its last raids on Japan was the fast carrier force of the British Pacific Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Rawlings. This force consisted of 28 ships, 4 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 6 light cruisers, and 17 destroyers. Rawlings reported to Halsey and operated in conjunction with him, but retained tactical control of his group. Under this plan, he could not be given direct orders by the American commander, but was informed of Halsey's directions to Task Force 38, which were considered as suggestions to be followed by the British. The agreement originally had provided that the British would take care of their own logistics, but when the need arose, they were fueled from our tankers at the same time as our forces. They participated with our carriers in the strikes on Japan, except for the attack on the Japanese fleet at Kura. Halsey assigned the British an alternate target, Osaka, which offered no warships of primary importance. His motive, he later stated in his book, was to forestall a possible post-war claim by Britain that she had delivered even a part of the final blow that demolished the Japanese fleet. The climax of this period of bombing Japan came on August 6th. A lone B-29 from Saipan dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, a city on the southern coast of Honshu with a pre-war population of over 300,000. It was not an ordinary bomb. American scientists had unlocked the secret of the atom, and for the first time in history, an atomic bomb had been used in warfare. It hit its target with unimaginable force and shocked the world by the awesome power of the atomic fission. Subsequent reconnaissance photos showed that more than 4 square miles, or 60% of the city's built-up area, had been totally destroyed. 3 days later, a similar bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. After the surrender of Japan, I visited both Hiroshima and Nagasaki and inspected the damage inflicted by these bombs. The central part of Hiroshima was a desert of utter destruction. The surface of the ground was a litter of bits of broken glass and minute pieces of metal which covered the area like sand. Not even the former location of streets and buildings could be distinguished. One modern steel and concrete building, near the outer limits of the bomb's destructive power, was still standing, but its windows had all been blasted out and the inside was completely gutted by fire. A 3-way concrete bridge, which had been the point of aim for the bomb, was still intact, but on its surface were printed the blurred outlines of shadows of people and vehicles that had been crossing it at the instant of the explosion. These shadows had been left on the surface, as on a photographic negative, by the radiation rays of the bomb. The effect produced by the atomic bombs was threefold. First, they created a tremendous pressure or concussion wave, which knocked down buildings and other objects as in a normal explosion, but with much greater violence. Second, they sent out an instantaneous heat wave in which temperatures reached thousands of degrees Fahrenheit and caused the spontaneous combustion of inflammable objects. Third, they emitted the deadly gamma rays which caused death by radiation and rendered radioactive materials with which they came in contact. The bomb at Hiroshima is estimated to have annihilated between 70,000 and 80,000 people outright, and to have inflicted terrible injuries on more than 100,000 others. Destruction in Nagasaki was similar to that in Hiroshima, but here the area under the bomb was cupped in a small valley surrounded by hills. Buildings in this locality were completely destroyed, but the land configuration apparently limited the effect of the bomb's explosion. The casualties, though heavy, were less than in Hiroshima, amounting to about 40,000 annihilated and 60,000 injured. Buildings on hilltops away from the center of the explosion were destroyed, whereas similar structures in the valleys, protected by the hills from the direct line to the bomb, remained undamaged. The profound influence of the atomic bomb on world politics and on the destiny of mankind cannot yet be fully appraised. Many of us who were fighting in the Pacific felt that the use of this terrible weapon was unnecessary. The Japanese at that time were a defeated people, and we had achieved this victory by orthodox methods of warfare. The ability of our naval and air forces to proceed up and down the coast of Japan, attacking at will, was evidence of Japan's helplessness. Unknown to us at the time, moreover, was the fact that Japanese authorities had been attempting for several months to establish a channel of surrender. In my opinion, the status of the war did not justify the use of this incredibly destructive missile. America's moral position in the world today would be better if we had not employed this superweapon of wholesale destruction. On the day before the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the Soviet government declared war on Japan and sent its army across the Siberian border into Manchuria. The Japanese forces there were a mere shell of what they had formerly been. Long since, their best units had been transferred to other areas where they had been shattered by our amphibious forces. The close of the war was fast approaching, and the collapse of Japanese resistance was close at hand. The entry of Russia into the Japanese war was unwelcome to many American fighting men in the Pacific. We had brought Japan to her knees, and American forces had accomplished this result practically single-handed. We acknowledged the assistance of New Zealand and Australia, and, to a lesser extent, of Great Britain, but the control of the Pacific Ocean was won primarily by the United States Navy, and the conquests on the ground had been principally accomplished by American troops. The winning of air control over the Pacific by the Navy's carriers constituted a revolutionary chapter in naval warfare. We resented the entry of Russia, which gave her grounds to claim part of the credit for the defeat of Japan and to demand a seat at the peace table. We considered that she was entitled to neither. It has been claimed that the dropping of the atomic bomb and Russia's entry into the war hastened the end of hostilities by giving the Japanese leaders the opportunity to surrender unconditionally and still save face, rather than continue a suicidal defense until the last Japanese was annihilated. But Admiral Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese fleet, stated afterward, "I do not think it would be accurate to look upon the atomic bomb and the entry and participation of Soviet Russia as direct causes of the termination of the war, but I think that those two factors did enable us to bring the war to a termination without creating too great chaos in Japan." On August 10th, the Japanese, through the Swiss government, stated that they were willing to accept the Allied surrender ultimatum issued at Potsdam on July 26th, provided they could keep their emperor. On the 11th came the news that Secretary of State James E. Byers, speaking for the Allied powers, had accepted the Japanese surrender provided that the Supreme Allied Commander ruled Japan through the authority of the Emperor. Nevertheless, the Third Fleet and Task Force 38 continued their attacks. Negotiations were continuing, but no orders for ceasing hostilities had been issued. At 1 o'clock on the morning of August 13th, Admiral Halsey received a dispatch from Admiral Nimitz directing him to cancel the day's strikes and to proceed with caution toward Tokyo. It seems that the ends of all wars produce their premature armistice instructions. This first dispatch to cease hostilities was followed shortly by one cancelling it. That day, a strike on Tokyo was made in which 254 Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground and 19 others shot down near the task force. On August 14th, the task force withdrew to fuel. With all hands tense for further news of the surrender, nothing came through. Plans were therefore made to strike Tokyo again on the 15th. Vice Admiral McCain signalled his force. "Our orders to strike indicate that the enemy may have dropped an unacceptable joker into the surrender terms. This war could last many months longer. We cannot afford to relax. Now is the time to pour it on. Show this to all pilots." On the morning of August 15th, the first strikes were launched at 4:15 a.m. and hit their targets 2 hours later. The second wave took off for its mission of destruction and was within 5 minutes of its objectives when the anticipated message from the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet came through. It said, "Air attack will be suspended. Acknowledge." The planes about to loose their bombs and rockets over the Japanese capital were recalled by radio, and those poised on the flight decks were informed that their flights were cancelled. It was the long-expected moment, the end of the fighting in the Pacific. The end of the fighting, practically, but not quite. The torpedo and bombing planes were stowed below on the hangar decks, but the fighter planes were kept on deck, and a strong combat air patrol was maintained overhead. Admiral Halsey ordered the fighters to investigate and shoot down all snoopers, not vindictively, but in a friendly sort of way. At 10:55 a.m., August 15, 1945, the Third Fleet received the following message from the Commander-in-Chief at Guam. Offensive operations against Japanese forces will cease at once. Continue searches and patrols. Maintain defensive and internal security measures at highest level. Beware of treachery. It was well that Halsey had taken precautions. Half an hour later, a Japanese bomber was sighted diving on the fleet. It was promptly shot down by a plane of the combat patrol, whose pilot reported, "Tally-ho, 1 bandit diving," and shortly afterward, "Splash 1 Judy." By the end of the day, a total of 8 enemy planes attempting to attack the fleet had been shot down. All were endeavoring to hit their targets in the kamikaze fashion. They were thought at the time to be individuals who refused to accept the surrender orders. Admiral Halsey stated later that in his opinion, they were simply units which had not been informed that the war was over, which was quite possible in view of the chaotic condition of Japan's damaged communications. Admiral Halsey addressed the assembled ships over the voice radio at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. As part of his talk, the adored and dynamic leader of the Third Fleet said, "Now that the fighting has ended, there must be no letdown. There must be watchful waiting. Victory is not the end, but the beginning. We must establish peace, a firm, a just and enduring peace." Although the fighting stopped on August 15th, the formal surrender was not to come until over 2 weeks later. In the interval, the Third Fleet organized landing parties of Blue Jackets and Marines to take over key positions on shore. The end, when it came, had been so unexpected that no organization had yet been set up to occupy the important ports to be taken over. General MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in the Pacific, but the troops for the occupation were at Okinawa or the Philippines, and it would take time to get them embarked and transported to Japan. Another task of the fleet during this period of waiting was the dispatch of relief flights to our prisoners of war. The Japanese were instructed to put up markers at all prisoner camps and to remove all restraint over the Allied personnel confined in them. But this did not provide our men with food, cigarettes, or other comforts. Our carrier planes were sent all over Japan as PW signs blossomed out in many different places. Wherever they did, planes were immediately sent to drop medicine, food, candy, cigarettes, toilet articles, etc. Many a pilot had a lump in his throat as he witnessed from the air the joyful demonstrations of the men on the ground as they gathered in the dropped supplies. Many of the prisoners were gaunt and weak from abuse and starvation. These errands of mercy went on continually until after the occupation landings, when the prisoners could be rescued. Every corner of Japan was searched out to find outlying and hidden camps where our people had been confined. It was a work cheerfully and eagerly undertaken by the carrier pilots, who felt that but for the grace of God, they might have been down there among the prisoners, instead of flying the planes overhead. On August 13th, in the closing days of the war, I took a plane to return to the combat area after my visit to the United States. I spent a night at Guam, where Admiral Nimitz told me he had just received a directive from President Truman to occupy the port of Dairen, near the former Japanese base at Port Arthur in southern Manchuria, before the Russians got there. He further commented that this seizure might cause trouble with the Russians. I never heard any more of this project, and presume it was later cancelled. In the end, Dairen was occupied by Russia when her troops invaded Manchuria and northern Korea. It is interesting to speculate on what would have happened had the United States taken this strategic Chinese port ahead of the Russians. It might have changed entirely the situation which developed in China after the war. After flying to Iwo Jima, where the tragedy of war was brought home by the sight of the marine cemeteries, with their row after row of white crosses, I embarked on the destroyer Benham and the next morning reported to Admiral Halsey off the coast of Japan. I hoisted my flag on the new carrier Lexington, named for the ship I had commanded when it was lost in the Battle of the Coral Sea over 3 years before. The fighting had stopped by this time, and we were waiting for the formal surrender and occupation. Blue Jacket and Marine landing forces were being organized and assembled on transports and small ships, ready for the moment when they would land and take possession of Japanese ports. I received the impression from the orders being issued that the carriers were going to be kept at sea indefinitely, while the battleships, cruisers, destroyers and other types were immediately to enter Tokyo Bay and other Japanese harbors. I sent a message to Admiral Halsey recommending that all carriers, as soon as conditions permitted, base in Japanese ports for the benefit of the morale of the men who had played such a prominent part in winning the war. I further pointed out that this would ease the problems of logistics and replenishment, and that the show of the carrier force in Japanese waters would be beneficial to the control of the conquered people. This recommendation was not approved, and the bulk of the aircraft carriers were denied the privilege of entering the enemy harbour with the victorious forces prior to the surrender ceremony. In the meantime, Japanese emissaries had been flown to Manila to receive instructions in regard to the details of the surrender. The first occupation force was to consist of the 11th Airborne Division, which was to be flown in by air transport planes and land at the airfield at Atsugi, near Tokyo. The Navy was to occupy the naval base at Yokosuka, near the entrance to Tokyo Bay. Finally, General MacArthur, who had been named Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, would arrive by plane and proceed to the battleship Missouri, at anchor off Yokohama, where the surrender document would be signed. The Navy was also to station a line of destroyers between Manila and Japan to act as guards for the planes flying in the troops. We went through 2 moderate typhoons on August 25th and 26th, which necessitated postponing the occupation plans for 48 hours. The operation of transporting the 11th Airborne Division, it was estimated, would take 5 or 6 days, and the ceremony for the official signing of the surrender was set for September 2nd. Although Navy planes were engaged in daily flights over Japan on their missions of parachuting supplies for the war prisoners, General MacArthur had issued instructions that they were not to land in Japan except in case of necessity. When the First Army planes landed at Atsugi on August 28th, they were surprised to find a large sign painted on the Japanese hangars. "Welcome to the United States Army from the Third Fleet." The Navy pilots making forced landings had beaten the Army in the race to get into Japan. Later it developed that the Navy boys were making so many landings at Atsugi Airport that orders were issued directing that disciplinary action be taken in cases where investigation disclosed that no real emergency had forced them down. It was stated that Navy planes making forced landings were arriving in such numbers as to congest the facilities. An amusing incident occurred on August 29th, a squabble over receiving the surrender of the Japanese submarine 1400. In accordance with the surrender terms, all enemy submarines were to surface and surrender to the nearest Allied ship. The I-400 complied with these instructions and surrendered to the destroyer Blue, attached to one of the carrier task groups, which put a prize crew on board and received the sword of the Japanese captain. In the meantime, a prize crew from one of our submarine tenders was sent out to bring the captured vessel into port. The new crew was under a commander who was senior to the commanding officer of the Blue. Upon his arrival, he ordered the captain of the Blue to return the sword to the Japanese commander and made the enemy captain surrender all over again. At this second ceremony, cameras were placed for taking pictures for posterity, showing the new officer receiving the surrender. He then departed with the enemy's sword in his possession. This was hotly protested by the carrier task group commander. Which officer finally retained possession of the submarine commander's sword I never found out. General MacArthur arrived by plane at Atsugi Airport on August 30th and set up his headquarters at the Grand Hotel in Yokohama. Admiral Halsey hoisted his flag at the ex-Japanese naval base at Yokosuka and on September 1st sent out a message authorizing Admiral McCain, commander of Task Force 38, to bring all flag officers who could be spared to the surrender ceremony set for the next day on the Missouri. The 11th hour message made no provision for transportation from the carrier task forces still cruising around at sea. I made arrangements to go in by plane from the Lexington. The weather was none too good as we catapulted from the carrier deck just at dawn. With low clouds and a ceiling of 700 feet, we flew close to the water and soon sighted the green shores of Japan, the landscape of terraced hills dotted with pagoda-like houses. As we neared Tokyo Bay, we sighted a convoy of about 40 transports, part of Vice Admiral T.S. Wilkinson's 3rd Amphibious Corps, entering the bay. The Yokosuka airfield was marked by many wrecks of Japanese planes which had been burned and destroyed by our airstrikes. As I got out of the plane, I was met by the new American commander of the field and his assistant. These officers turned out to be Captain H.S. Duckworth, who had been my air officer on the Lexington in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and Commander Noel Gaylor, one of our leading fighter pilots in that action. It was a heartwarming experience to meet these former shipmates who had started the war with me on the Lexington almost 4 years before, on my first landing on Japanese soil at the end of the fighting. I proceeded at once by boat to the Missouri, anchored off the naval station, where I was met by Admiral Halsey. Much activity was going on in preparation for the ceremony. Dozens of high-ranking officers of all nationalities, Americans, British, Russians, Chinese, French, Canadians, Australians, Dutch and New Zealanders, were coming aboard for the historic occasion. In his cabin, Admiral Halsey confided to me that I would be ordered soon after the surrender to take a task force through the Panama Canal to New York City to celebrate Navy Day, October 27th. On the half-deck overlooking the forecastle, just outside Admiral Halsey's cabin, there was a crew's mess table covered with a green cloth. Outboard of the deck itself and overhanging the water was a temporary platform built to accommodate 40 or 50 camera and newsreel men. The weather was cool, with high overcast, and by now the sun was occasionally trying to break through. Among the many distinguished American officers present were General Jonathan D. Wainwright, Admiral Richmond K. Turner, Generals Carl Sparks and George Commander Kenny, Vice Admirals John S. McCain, John H. Towers and Charles Lockwood, Lieutenant Generals Robert L. Eichelberger, Richard K. Sutherland, Barney Giles, James Doolittle, Roy S. Geiger and Nathaniel Twining, Rear Admirals Jack Shafroth, Carey Jones, Don Beery, Jerry Wiltz, Oscar Badger and many others. All the American officers were in khaki shirts without ties, with no coats, and wearing no decorations. This had been our uniform during the fighting, and it was deliberately prescribed for this occasion to impress the Japanese with the fact that no honours were being given them. The foreign officers wore their blouses. About 8:45, General MacArthur, with his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard K. Sutherland, arrived on a destroyer which came alongside the port side. They disappeared into Admiral Halsey's cabin to await the arrival of the Japanese emissaries. About 5 minutes later, the enemy party came alongside the starboard gangway in a small motorboat. A pompous little man, garbed in a high silk hat, frock coat and striped trousers, and carrying a cane, was the first to get out of the boat and arrive at the top of the ladder. It was Mamoru Shigemitsu, Japanese foreign minister. He was followed by 2 other men in top hats and frock coats, another in a civilian white sack suit, and 6 others in army field uniforms of olive green with red trimmings. No honours were rendered the enemy delegation. Nobody offered to shake hands with them, and they were greeted by a stony silence. Only stares of curiosity were directed at these men who represented a nation which had descended into the depths of barbarism in conducting the war. Shigemitsu had difficulty negotiating the ladder and was helped by one of his party. This was the only evidence of his artificial leg, except that he limped and used a cane. The number 2 man of the delegation, a short, stocky individual in uniform, was General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Japanese Imperial General Staff. All of the party wore grim expressions, as if they were tasting the bitterness of defeat. The Japanese party was ushered to a small open square in front of the table upon which lay the documents to be signed. All around them, the ship was crowded with spectators, the high-ranking Allied officers lined up inboard of the central table and behind it, and other officers and bluejackets jamming every inch of space from which the spectacle could be viewed. The tops of the turrets, the bridges and the mast overhead were all crowded with men in uniform. General MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey in the latter's cabin allowed the Japanese representatives to await their presence for an appreciable time. As I looked at the Japanese party, I presume I shared my mixed feelings with the hundreds of other watchers. My heart thrilled at the thought that the war was over, and that now, at last, we could get back to normal and resume peacetime living. On the other hand, my mind went back to the hundreds and thousands of fellow Americans, many of them close personal friends or their sons, who had given their lives that this day might come. After an appropriate interval, General MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey came out of the cabin and stood behind the table facing the Japanese delegation. Microphones had been set up for broadcasting the proceedings to the world. The ears, if not the eyes of mankind, were concentrated on that scene. With a stern expression, General MacArthur stepped forward and made the following speech. We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. Nor is it for us here to meet, representing as we do a majority of the peoples of the earth, in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred. But rather is it for us, both victors and vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity which alone befits the sacred purpose we are about to serve, committing all of our peoples unreservedly to faithful compliance with the undertakings they are here formally to assume. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. The terms and conditions upon which the surrender of the Japanese Imperial forces here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it is my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities, with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated. Shigemitsu signed first, and had a little difficulty with his pen. There were two documents, bound in large books, side by side, one in English and the other in Japanese. Each man signed twice, once in each book. Only the page of signatures was exposed. Following the Japanese Foreign Minister, General Umezu signed, and the enemy representatives stepped back. Then General MacArthur announced that he would sign for all the Allied powers. He used 5 pens, making part of his signature with each one. He asked General Jonathan M. Wainwright and British General Arthur Percival to attend while he signed. Wainwright had surrendered at Corregidor and Percival at Singapore in the early part of the war. Both had since been prisoners of the Japanese, and had only recently been released. Their physical appearance showed signs of their long incarceration. General MacArthur presented each of them with one of the silver-tipped pens he had used. I learned later that of the 3 others, one had been presented to the battleship Missouri and one to President Truman, and the other retained by General MacArthur himself. Admiral Nimitz was then called to sign for the United States. He asked Admiral Halsey and Rear Admiral Forrest P. Sherman, his operations officer, to attend while he signed, and gave each of them one of the pens he used. The Chinese delegation signed next, somewhat to my surprise. General Xu Yung-chang was their signatory. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser was next, for the British, then Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevianko for the Soviet Union, General Sir Thomas Blamey for Australia, Colonel Lawrence Cosgrove for Canada, General Jacques Leclerc for France, Admiral C.E.L. Helfrich for the Netherlands, and Air Vice Marshal Leonard Easitt for New Zealand. With perfect timing just at this time, thousands of American planes began passing in stately formation overhead in further demonstration of the power that had won the war. They were planes from the carriers off the coast and formations of the Army's B-29s, which had been bombing Japan only a short time before. General MacArthur then said, "Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are now closed." With these remarks, he walked off to Admiral Halsey's cabin, accompanied by Admirals Nimitz, Halsey and Fraser and other high-ranking officers. Thus ended the most thrilling episode of my life. In a glass case on the bulkhead alongside the spot where the ceremony had occurred was an American flag which had been flown by Commodore Perry when he opened Japan to the commerce of the world in 1854. At the masthead of the Missouri that day flew the same American ensign which had flown over the White House in Washington on December 7, 1941. After the ceremony, the Japanese were ushered to the gangway and left. Nobody saluted them or shook hands with them. They just left. Thus ended the greatest war in history. The naval part of that war had seen the concentration in the United States fleet of greater power than the world ever dreamed possible. This fleet was more than twice as strong as the second largest navy, that of Great Britain, no longer the mistress of the seas. The war had witnessed a revolution in high seas, fighting in which the weight of naval strength had passed from the battleship of yore to the aircraft carrier. Submarines, cruisers, destroyers, patrol torpedo boats, tankers, auxiliaries, yes, even battleships, as well as the amphibious troops of the Army and the Marine Corps, the Army Air Force, and all the arms of our allies, the British, Australians, New Zealanders, Dutch, Chinese, Free French, and Filipinos, all were part of the team. But the ships which secured and held control of the sea and made all the other operations possible were the United States Navy's aircraft carriers and their aircraft squadrons. The winning of the control of the Pacific was their accomplishment, and the recognition of this job, well done, is their reward. Before discussing the conclusions and lessons of the Pacific War from the American standpoint, it seems well to take up the reasons for Japan's downfall from the standpoint of her own mistakes. Her naval strategy achieved wonderful success at the beginning of the Pacific War. Why did it fail over the longer period, and what were the errors which contributed most to Japan's ultimate defeat? Whereas the main cause of that defeat was the vast difference in material and industrial resources between the United States and Japan, nevertheless the Japanese made serious mistakes which played a large part in their downfall. The basic war plan comprised first the seizure of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, which contained the oil, tin, rubber, foodstuffs and other resources which were vital to Japan for carrying on the war. Second, the attack on the United States fleet in Hawaii to prevent it from interfering with their operations in the Western Pacific. And third, the establishment of a defensive perimeter of outlying islands behind which they could develop their resources and conduct their economy undisturbed by external forces. Under these plans, all that remained for the Japanese to do after these three initial undertakings were completed was to consolidate and destroy any attacking force which might threaten that line. They estimated that the United States would take little interest in fighting a war so far from home and, rather than accept the losses required to breach the Japanese defense line, would be willing to make peace on the basis of the status quo. The Japanese concept was undoubtedly based on the belief that Hitler would win the war in Europe or at least force a compromise peace in that area. It is inconceivable that Japan would have undertaken a war against the combined might of the United States, the British Empire and the Netherlands, unless her leaders had thought that Germany would keep the armed strength of the Allies preoccupied in other regions than the Orient. From the beginning of the Pacific War, I consistently predicted that Japan would collapse within 6 months after the fall of Germany. This prediction was based primarily on psychology, in the belief that the entire Japanese estimate must have rested on the fundamental assumption that Germany would win, or at least achieve a stalemate. If Germany lost, the whole foundation of the Japanese decision would disintegrate. Actually, Japan surrendered a little more than 3 months after Germany succumbed. The initial successes of the Japanese forces went to their heads. Instead of being content with the defensive line originally contemplated, they proceeded to attempt further expansion. With their limited resources, they even delayed consolidation and strengthening of the planned defensive perimeter. The original line was to be one joining the Kurils, Marshalls, Bismarcks, Timor, Java, Sumatra, Malaya, and Burma. When their first operations were successfully completed with such unexpected ease, the Japanese attempted to extend their control to Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea, to Midway in the Central Pacific in order to strengthen the defences of that area, where they also hoped to force a decisive engagement with the United States fleet, and to the western Aleutians in order to buttress the defences of the northern area. If these operations were successful, they then intended to seize New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa for the purpose of cutting the lines of communication between the United States and Australia. One of the gravest mistakes in the Japanese strategy was their failure to realize that overseas bases can be held only by control of the sea. When this is lost, the bases can no longer obtain the supplies and reinforcements vital to their continued existence. For the Japanese to hold their defensive line, they would ultimately have to meet and defeat the United States fleet in a contest for control of the sea. In such a clash, the attacker has the advantage of choosing the point of attack, and the defender cannot be strong everywhere. Although the Japanese displayed an early recognition of the vital role of aircraft carriers in exercising control of the sea, it is doubtful whether they fully appreciated the ability of the United States to build up its strength in this important class of ships. Had they done so, the hopelessness of their position against our superior sea forces would have been apparent, and they might have refrained from challenging our power. The first setback the Japanese received was in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, which turned back their attempt to capture Port Moresby by sea. In this battle they lost one carrier and almost all of the planes and pilots from the two other carriers engaged. We lost the Lexington, but the American task force still included the slightly damaged Yorktown, with a full complement of her own planes and additional ones recovered from the Lexington. Potentially, she dominated the situation. In spite of the advantage we held, the American commander withdrew from the Coral Sea. Had the Japanese but known it, with the withdrawal of our task force they could have continued on, and Port Moresby would have fallen within 48 hours, since there were no other forces then available to stop them. But the enemy were unaware of these facts, and themselves retired to what they considered safer waters. This tactical defeat by inferior forces was the first naval repulse that Japan had experienced in all its modern history. A month later, in their attempt to capture Midway, the Japanese had a greatly superior carrier force to repel our weaker force of only 3 carriers. Even though their plans contemplated seeking a decisive engagement with the American fleet, they neglected to guard their security by sending scouting planes ahead of their ships to find out what American forces were within the area and in a position to threaten them. This failure resulted in the loss of 4 of their carriers, as compared with only 1 of ours, and brought about a change in the existing ratio of naval power in the Pacific. Whereas the Japanese had previously possessed superiority in aircraft carriers, they were now reduced to a level of approximate equality. The new situation, beginning in the summer of 1942, was one in which neither side had sufficient superiority to take the offensive. More than a year later, in the fall of 1943, the newly built American aircraft carriers of the Essex type started arriving in the Pacific in ever-increasing numbers, and the United States fleet achieved sufficient superiority to take the offensive in its march across the Pacific, which was ultimately destined to end at Tokyo less than 2 years later. This offensive never stopped, but relentlessly rolled on in such rapid advances that the Japanese were never able to get set for the next blow. The success of the offensive was due mainly to our control of the sea through the power of our carriers. Having that control, we were able to keep our supplies moving wherever we desired and to cut the enemy's lines of communication to all their outlying bases. There were other errors in the Japanese strategy. They failed to provide an adequate replacement program to take care of their losses in aviation pilots. They failed to realize the enormous quantity of merchant shipping which would be required to exploit their gains in the southern area and to supply their bases in their defensive perimeter. They further failed to make sufficient provision for protection of their shipping lanes against the attacks of our submarines. The Japanese made many tactical errors which undoubtedly had some effect on strategy. Among these were the failure to go in and destroy our transports off Guadalcanal after the First Battle of Savo Island, their failure to continue on to Port Moresby in spite of their repulse in the Battle of the Coral Sea, their withdrawal from the action of the Komandorskis when they had our inferior forces helpless and at their mercy, and their failure to enter Leyte Gulf after the action off Samar. In retrospect, it is amazing that Japan ever thought she could be successful in a war against the United States. It is evident that the Japanese failed to estimate properly their own military and economic requirements for such a war, and grossly underestimated the potential of the United States. But perhaps their greatest error was their failure to appreciate the will to fight of the American people. It is said that many Japanese considered the United States a nation of pacifists. It is impossible to say how far such opinions influenced their decision to initiate the war. Fundamentally, their naval strategy failed not only because of their inadequate resources as compared with ours, but also because of their faulty appraisal of American psychology. But there are also conclusions to be drawn and lessons to be learned from the American side of the picture. We have been prone to think of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, as the greatest naval disaster in our history. Actually, it had little effect, from a material standpoint, on the control of the Pacific Ocean. Although the fact was not fully recognized by many high-ranking officers at the time, Battleships were already out of date and were destined to play only a small part in the outcome of the war. Psychologically, however, the attack on Pearl Harbor had profound effects. First, it united the American people in a willingness to go to war and in an all-out prosecution of the war effort, as nothing else could have done. The second psychological effect of the attack on Pearl Harbor was to disrupt instantaneously the previous conceptions of naval authorities as to the supremacy of the battleship. It was probably well that we learned this lesson at the very beginning of the war rather than later. If the battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor had gone down later in the open sea, as did the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, the loss of life and the strategic disaster would have been much more serious. The sinking of these battleships in the shallow waters of Fong Harbor forced a reconsideration of the stereotyped plans then, in effect for fighting a war with Japan. The Japanese attack, which opened hostilities, was made possible by their superiority in large aircraft carriers. At this time, they had approximately 10 carriers in commission, compared with our 7, of which only 3 were in the Pacific. Although they were well in advance of most naval thinking, the Japanese themselves did not realize fully the potential dominating role of carriers. But thenceforth, aircraft from carriers were destined to rule the sea from the sky overhead. Our weakness in carriers would have forced us to take the defensive in the early part of the war, even if there had been no Pearl Harbor. It was primarily responsible for the loss of the Philippines, Guam, and Wake. Another condition which made the early days of the Pacific campaign so desperate was the decision to give the war in the Atlantic first priority and to channel the bulk of men and material to that theater. Contrary to the general impression, Alaska and the Aleutians were never a very critical theater. The idea that these areas could be used as stepping stones for an invasion of the continental United States is hardly tenable. Alaska is a country that offers almost no resources to sustain an invading army, and all supplies and equipment for its invasion would have to be brought overseas. In addition, the severe weather in that region makes nature herself a formidable opponent there. As a practical matter, invasion routes in more temperate climates are more feasible, and our own invasion routes to Japan took the much longer but much more favorable way across the South and Central Pacific. The tremendous distances of the Pacific necessitated a completely new kind of naval warfare. Our first offensive operation in the Solomon Islands was conducted roughly 5,000 miles from our Pacific coast bases. The logistics of our campaigns in those far-off areas necessitated colossal amounts of shipping to transport the vast quantities of essential supplies. Port facilities for unloading these materials were non-existent, and their lack resulted in long delays at the terminals and added to the tonnage of shipping required. An amazing accomplishment of the United States Navy was the development of the service squadrons, those groups of ships which furnished food, ammunition, and supplies of every description to our fighting ships at sea, thus enabling them to remain in combat areas almost indefinitely. These squadrons were floating bases in almost every sense of the word, and lacked only the ability to dry dock ships to be able to furnish every requirement. To a large extent, only the necessity for giving rest and relaxation to the personnel required our combatant ships ever to return to port. The war in the Pacific, while fundamentally naval in character, illustrated the necessity of teamwork between all branches of the service. Naval aviation spearheaded the advance and gained control of the sea, but its effort would have gone for naught had our amphibious forces not been able to seize the advance bases from which our power could gradually be extended to the enemy's homeland. The tasks of all these services would have been rendered much more difficult had it not been for the enormous destruction of enemy shipping by our submarines, which helped defeat the Japanese efforts to exploit their conquests. The advantage of unity of command was one of the great lessons of the Pacific War. In a campaign requiring participation by many branches of the Army and Navy, unity of direction of effort is essential. This can be accomplished only by unity of command in the operating theatre. It was secured at the top by the overall direction of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, who, in effect, became a general staff. In the lower echelons, unity of command was not as complete as it might have been, as shown by the separate operations conducted by General MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and those in the contiguous area of the South Pacific under Admiral Halsey. Lack of unity of command also affected the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Battle for Leyte Gulf, where the Japanese Central Force passed through San Bernardino Strait without opposition when Admiral Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet under General MacArthur, and Admiral Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet under Admiral Nimitz, each thought the other was taking care of the situation. Whereas mistakes of omission and commission played their part in the Pacific War, it should not be overlooked that after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the loss of Wake, Guam, and the Philippines, America never lost a campaign in the Pacific. Such results could not have been obtained had not the basic planning been sound, and had not the execution these plans been carried out intelligently and aggressively. Individual exploits of heroism and devotion to duty were legion. The leadership of the officers in all echelons could not have been other than brilliant to win the victories which our forces achieved against one of the most fanatical and determined enemies in history. In finding fault with the conduct of any specific operation, these basic facts should be kept in mind. The war in the Pacific will be known to future generations as one of the greatest undertakings in all the long history of conflicts between nations for supremacy. It will achieve this distinction because of the magnitude of the distances involved, the enormous numbers of men and ships employed, the undeveloped nature of much of the territory over which the campaigns were fought, and the decisiveness of the results obtained. It will also be recorded as the first occasion when man used the terrible energy of the atomic bomb to destroy his fellow men. As the Pacific War differed from all previous wars, so will the next war differ from the last one. Over the horizon we can see the approaching developments in the fields of atomic science, guided missiles, and pilotless aircraft. If America is to be preserved, we must maintain our preparedness for war. The most vital lesson for the future leaders of our air, naval, and ground forces is that no two wars are ever alike. They must keep their minds wide open in applying the new developments of science to the art of war. The principles of warfare do not change, but the weapons do, and our civilization could be destroyed should we fail to keep abreast of new possibilities. Man has always dreamed of universal peace, yet history would indicate that for the foreseeable future, at least, it is a vain hope. If we desire to preserve what our civilization has developed, if we wish to retain our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we must continue to be prepared spiritually and materially to defend our destinies on the field of battle.